Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com. This is anti-war news for Wednesday, April 10th, 2024. All right, the first story at the top of antiwar.com today. Biden says that Israel should call for a 6 to 8 week ceasefire. So President Biden said in an interview with Univision that aired on Tuesday that Israel should call a 6 to 8 week ceasefire and appeared not to condition a truce on a hostage deal with Hamas. So Biden said in this interview, and this was recorded last Wednesday, so keep that in mind, but he said, quote, "So what I'm calling for is for the Israelis to just call for a ceasefire. Allow for the next 6-8 weeks total access to all food and medicine going into the country. I've spoken with everyone from the Saudis to the Jordanians to the Egyptians. They're prepared to move in. They're prepared to move this food in. And I think there's no excuse to not provide for the medical and the food needs of those people. It should be done now," end quote. So this seems like a shift. Biden basically calling for a ceasefire without calling for a hostage deal to be attached, temporary ceasefire. But it's unclear if this really means a shift in policy. On the same day, before the interview aired, you had President Biden's top officials pinning the blame for the lack of a ceasefire on Hamas. This was both Antony Blinken and Jake Sullivan were saying this on Tuesday. Blinken's quote was, quote, "Hamas has an opportunity now to agree to the proposal on a ceasefire and hostages. The ball is in Hamas's court. The world is watching to see what it does," end quote. So putting it all on Hamas and not Israel. And as I covered yesterday, Hamas rejected Israel's latest proposal. They said that it did not address their main demands, which include they want a permanent ceasefire and they want the free movement of displaced Palestinians so they could go back to the north. So it's also not clear if Biden will use the significant leverage that he has to pressure Israel to declare a unilateral ceasefire. The day after this interview, so remember, this was last week on Wednesday was this interview, and then the next day was when Biden spoke with Netanyahu and told him to allow more aid into Gaza and do some other things. So Israel has claimed that more trucks are entering the Gaza Strip, but the UN is disputing these numbers, and we'll get more into that in the next story. But in this interview, Biden also called Netanyahu's approach to Gaza a mistake and said that he did not agree with his approach. But for Biden to say that, I mean, it's completely ridiculous because Biden has been Netanyahu's biggest backer in this thing. The Biden administration has approved over 100 arms deals for Israel, including recently, more bombs, more huge 2,000-pound bombs. It doesn't matter how many civilians they kill, how many residential buildings they demolish. Biden has just consistently been supporting them, also providing them with intelligence sharing and, of course, the political cover, vetoing several UN resolutions and rejecting the International Court of Justice's ruling that it is plausible Israel is committing genocide. So, this could be, and I saw most of the headlines from this interview were Biden saying that Netanyahu has made a mistake. So it's kind of that narrative that Biden is so mad at Netanyahu, but are we actually going to see anything change? And hopefully we do, because we have seen all these Democrats in Congress more and more are starting to flip, it seems like. So hopefully that combined with the pressure from below does something, makes a change. All right, so the next one here, crossing into North Gaza is still not open despite the Israeli commitment. So Israel's Erez border crossing into northern Gaza has still not been open for aid deliveries despite a commitment Israel made last week to do so following a call between Biden and Netanyahu. And this was reported by the Spanish newspaper El País. So the Biden told Netanyahu to take more action to allow aid into Gaza after the killing of the World Central Kitchen workers. And after the call, the Israeli cabinet approved the opening of this Erez border crossing, and they also approved the use of the Israeli port of Ashdod as a hub for humanitarian aid for Palestinians in Gaza. But according to this report, Israel has yet to fulfill either commitment. And I know the border crossing hasn't been opened because the U.S. was saying on Tuesday that it should be open this week. And now we're also seeing the Israeli government said that 468 aid trucks were allowed into Gaza on Tuesday, which is a record high. But UN officials are disputing these numbers. They say that most of the trucks being counted are only half full when they're inspected by Israel. And if I understand what they're saying correctly, they're saying Israel inspects the trucks. They require them to be half full. And then the trucks reload and fill, they fill up all the trucks. So that means about half of those trucks that Israel actually inspects will enter Gaza. And this aid is still only being allowed in mainly through Egypt's Rafah border crossing and to a lesser extent the Kerem Shalom crossing. And these are in both connect to southern Gaza. So it's unclear how much food aid is getting into the north, which is where it needs to go. People are facing food shortages everywhere, but it's the worst in northern Gaza. And that's one of the reasons why Israel said that they would open this border crossing, but it still hasn't happened. I mean, how long could it take to do that? It doesn't seem like anything should really slow that down. So there's a quote here from a spokesman for the UN's humanitarian agency, Jens Lark, saying that food aid has been subject to the most restrictions, demonstrating that Israel is purposely, imposing this starvation blockade on Gaza. Lark said, quote, food convoys that should be going particularly to the north, where 70% of people face famine conditions, are 3 times more likely to be denied than other humanitarian convoys with other kinds of material, end quote. So saying that out of all the humanitarian aid, the hardest thing to get up there is food. And then I just mentioned that the U.S. is still supporting Israel despite this, even though they said, they have to take these measures, implement these measures, and they're not doing it so far. That border crossing still hasn't been opened. All right, so the next one here, Israeli Defense Minister contradicts Netanyahu, says that there is no date for a Rafah invasion. So Axios reported on Tuesday that Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant has contradicted Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu by saying that Israel has not set a date to launch its invasion of the southern Gaza city of Rafah. Netanyahu made the claim on Monday that there is a date for a full-scale assault on Rafah, where over 1 million Palestinians are sheltering. The U.S. State Department responded by saying that the U.S. hadn't been briefed on the Israeli plans and that it was unaware a date had been set. So on Tuesday, Gallant spoke with Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin and told him the opposite of what Netanyahu said. He said a date has not been set. This is according to multiple media reports. Gallant didn't say this publicly, but I saw it was reported by Axios and Haaretz, the Israeli paper, and a few other sources. So an Israeli invasion of Rafah, of course, would incur huge civilian casualties, and it would disrupt the aid that's coming through the Rafah border crossing, which is where most of it is coming in. U.S. officials have been warning Israel against attacking Rafah without coming up with a plan to protect civilians. But we don't know if the U.S. is threatening real consequences if they do it or not. So Secretary of State Antony Blinken said on Tuesday that he believed U.S. and Israeli officials will discuss the plan to attack Rafah next week. He said the U.S. does, quote, not have a date for any operation, at least one that's been communicated to us by the Israelis. What we have is an ongoing conversation with Israel on any operation, end quote. And then Jake Sullivan said that the U.S. has still not seen a credible plan to account for Rafah's civilians. All right, so the next one here, Austin claims that there is no evidence of genocide in Gaza. So Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin on Tuesday claimed there was no evidence of genocide in Gaza despite the massive civilian casualties and also the starvation. Senator Tom Cotton, the neocon senator from Arkansas asked Austin if he believed genocide was being committed in Gaza in response to protesters who disrupted a Senate Armed Services Committee hearing. And they said that the U.S. was complicit in genocide by arming Israel. So Cotton asked Austin, is what these protesters are saying true? Do you think Israel's committing genocide? And Austin said that the U.S. does not have evidence of genocide. And his comments align with the U.S. government's rejection of the International Court of Justice's ruling that it's plausible Israel is committing genocide. So these were activists with Code Pink, and they put out videos of them disrupting this Senate hearing. And they said that peace activists disrupted the hearing 25 times. And Medea Benjamin, the co-founder of Code Pink, said that they were there to say, stop the complicity, stop sending the weapons, stop sharing intelligence, stop it all, stop killing all these people. And one of the activists who disrupted the hearing was a Palestinian American who said that over 100 of his family members have been killed by Israel in the bombardment of Gaza, which is that's just a huge number of people to lose. And the latest numbers from Gaza's health ministry, they put the death toll at over 33,000, including over 14,000 children. And that does not account for the thousands of people under the rubble. Israel, you always hear this from Israel supporters in the U.S. They cast doubt on the numbers coming out of Gaza. But there was, a few months ago, the Hebrew language news website Local Call, which is the sister site of 972 magazine, which had that report on the AI that Israel's using to bomb people in the Gaza Strip. Local Call reported in January that the Israeli military determined that the figures in Gaza were reliable and said that they used them actually to estimate how many civilians they've killed. And I've seen other reports in Israeli media that have said the Israeli military determined that the numbers were fairly accurate. And this is the only one I've seen that it basically says that they agree with them on the civilian count, because you see Israel claim they've killed way more Hamas fighters. And then keep in mind that the recent report from Haaretz that said Israel's creating what they call kill zones, and anybody, where the military operates, and anybody killed in that area is considered a terrorist, even if they're unarmed or are civilians. So anyway, it's good to see this stuff, get disrupted, and they've been really relentless through this whole thing, Code Pink and all the activists that are involved with them. All right, so the next one here, aid experts warn that the Gaza death toll could exceed 100,000. So this article is from Kyle Anzalone at the Libertarian Institute. It says a group of aid experts said that more than 100,000 Palestinians could be killed by a combination of Israeli strikes, famine, and plague if the humanitarian conditions in Gaza are not significantly improved. And this is, they're saying more than 100,000 Palestinians could be killed by August. And their estimation is that if Israel attacks Rafah, the death toll would be higher. I think they said up to 120,000. But if the conditions stay the same, they're saying by August, when you talk about excess mortality caused by disease, starvation, all these things, that they expect 100,000 people to be dead by August. So that's not that far away. And this is a professor of epidemiology and international health at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. And some other scientists are saying this as well. All right. So the next one here, videos, eyewitnesses cast doubt on Israel's claim on the flower massacre. So this is from CNN. And the title of this is called Dying for a Bag of Flour. Videos and eyewitnesses accounts cast doubt on Israel's timeline of deadly Gaza aid delivery. So you should really watch the video. They did a video investigation of what is now known as the Flower Massacre. This was on February 29th when Israeli forces opened fire on Palestinians waiting for aid, trying to get aid, and over 100 people were killed. And then you had Israel immediately claim that it was a stampede that killed them, even though they admitted to opening some fire. And you've had the Palestinian doctors at the nearby hospital saying that the majority of people they treated were people with gunshot wounds. And this basically reveals, I didn't know that Israel put out a timeline of the event claiming that, I forget exactly what their story is, but they're still claiming that most of the people were killed by being trampled. But this really just examines the timeline and also talks to lots of eyewitnesses who say, no, they opened fire on us, and that's what killed most of the people. But go check it out, see all the evidence that they have compiled here. And, again, this is CNN. This isn't, we're seeing a lot of this, all these mainstream outlets in the U.S., they might have a very pro-Israel bias historically, but sometimes they just cover things, and there's really no way to paint Israel in a positive light in these stories. All right, so the next one here, the U.S. announces a $138 million arms deal for Ukraine. So the State Department announced on Tuesday an emergency foreign military sale to Ukraine for $138 million worth of equipment to maintain and upgrade its Hawk air defense systems. The deal is being paid for by U.S. military aid for Ukraine that was included in the U.S.'s annual military spending bill that President Biden signed into law last month. So this is aid that was included for the 2024 National Defense Authorization Act. This is separate from the other aid that has been sent to Ukraine. This is annual aid, and this bill included $300 million for Ukraine in the form of foreign military financing, which is a State Department program that gives foreign governments money to buy U.S. weapons. And I was actually thinking to myself recently when they were going to start using that, and they didn't wait very long here. And they're saying that this is an emergency sale, so that means they're going to expedite it, but it still could take a while for these air defense systems to get there. And this comes as Russia has been stepping up missile and drone strikes against infrastructure across Ukraine. Russia's strikes have been much more effective as Moscow has better intelligence at this point, and they're finding gaps in Ukraine's air defense systems. They're adapting to Ukraine's Western air defense systems that they've gotten as well. And of course, Ukraine's air defenses have been significantly depleted. So this is, Biden's still struggling to get that $60 billion because he wants to fuel this proxy war for another year, even though it's clear Ukraine has no chance of winning on the battlefield. They just want to prolong it. So here's some more money for Ukraine. All right, so the next one here, U.S. transfers weapons in the Middle East to Ukraine, weapons that it seized in the Middle East. This one's from Kyle Anzalone. U.S. Central Command reported that it sent thousands of small arms and rocket launchers to Ukraine that it seized in the Middle East. They're claiming that these weapons were bound for the Houthis in Yemen. And they've done this before. They did this a few months ago. And I think it just really shows that the hypocrisy of the U.S. to seize weapons. I mean, these are small arms and say, no, they can't go there, but they can go here. This is the war that we want to fuel. So the move comes as the White House is still seeking to get more money for Ukraine, Kyle mentions. And U.S. Central Command announced the transfer. They said that the U.S. government transferred over 5,000 AK-47s, machine guns, sniper rifles, RPGs, and over 500,000 rounds of 7.62 millimeter ammunition to the Ukrainian armed forces. They said that this constitutes enough material to equip one Ukrainian brigade with small arms rifles, or maybe one neo-Nazi militia. These weapons will help Ukraine, they're saying, will help Ukraine defend against Russia's invasion. So desperate measures that they are going to here to keep this proxy war going. And, I don't think there's been any real shortage of rifles and things like that. All right, so the next one here, with no way out, Zelensky's options look bad or worse. So this article is from the Washington Post, and really the story here is that the Washington Post is running this story, and it basically says Zelensky is in a really bad position because he's got nowhere to go, no chance at victory on the battlefield, but negotiating a deal with Russia is not politically, if he gives away territory, not gives it away, I mean, it's not his to give away at this point, but if he concedes territory at any part of deal, then politically he's done. So it's just interesting to see this in the Washington Post. I'll read a little bit of it. It says, as Russia steps up airstrikes and once again advances on the battlefield in Ukraine more than 2 years into its bloody invasion, there is no end to the fighting in sight, and President Volodymyr Zelensky's options for what to do next, much less how to win the war, range from bad to worse. Zelensky has said Ukraine will accept nothing less than the return of all of its territory, including Crimea, but with the battle lines changing little in the last year, militarily retaking swaths of east and south Ukraine that Russia now occupies, which is about 20% of the country, appears increasingly unlikely. And they're saying that negotiating with Putin is politically toxic inside Ukraine. The Ukrainian public is opposed to surrendering territory, and Putin has shown no willingness to, they say, accept anything short of Ukraine's capitulation to his demands. But his demands are, it's not clear exactly if they got into negotiations, but the main Russian demand has been neutrality. That's what it was before they annexed the territory that they captured. But as the war dragged on, then they annexed the territory. So Russia's demands, if there's talks, would be Ukrainian neutrality and that these territories would become Russia. I would be surprised if they offered anything, any sort of, of that territory back. And it says the status quo is awful, with the fight now a grinding stalemate. Ukrainians are dying on the battlefield daily, but a ceasefire is also a non-starter because it would just give the Russians time to replenish their forces. That's kind of a nonsensical talking point. I think you see that from people when it comes to Gaza. Is a ceasefire just gives the other side time to replenish forces, but doesn't that give your side time to replenish forces too? Doesn't really make sense. But it's interesting. This says Ukrainian and Western officials view Zelensky as largely stuck, and they quote Western officials who say that, and Ukrainian officials as well. All right, so the next story here, Israeli airstrikes in Syria target the Syrian army. So this article is from The Cradle, and it says Israeli warplanes bombed Deraa in the south of Syria late on April 9th in response to a rocket attack from Syrian territory toward Israel. And this was reported by the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, which is based in the UK. And in a statement, the Israeli army actually announced these airstrikes, which they rarely do. They're saying that its jets attacked military infrastructure. They're saying it was a response to shelling in Israeli territory. And the Cradle points out, this is about a week after Israel leveled the consulate in Damascus. And by their count, this is the 33rd time Israel has attacked Syria this year, which Israel has been bombing Syria for years, but they've really stepped these airstrikes up since October 7th and really escalated the attacks against Iranians, of course, not just by bombing that consulate, but also over the past few months, they've killed about 7 IRGC guys before the consulate bombing, which killed another 7. So they've just really been stepping up these attacks. All right, so the last story here, German troops in Lithuania for a permanent deployment. So on Monday, Germany began deploying troops to Lithuania, where they will be stationed permanently, marking the first deployment of its kind for the German military since World War II. So only 24 German soldiers have arrived in Lithuania so far, and the force will increase to 4,800 by 2027. Germany already leads a NATO deployment in Lithuania with 1,000 troops, but this new force is permanent. So they're saying this is our first, I'll read this from Germany's defense minister. He said, quote, "This is the first time that we have permanently stationed such a unit outside of Germany," end quote. So it's just funny. You see Germany and Lithuania kind of celebrating this, but I don't think that's anything to celebrate, Germany deploying troops on a permanent basis for the first time since World War II. That's just not something to celebrate. Besides the obvious connotation it has with the Nazi occupation of Lithuania, but just the fact that, does that mean you're preparing for World War III? How is that something to be happy about? So Lithuania shares a border with Kaliningrad, the Russian oblast on the Baltic Sea that's separated from the Russian mainland. So Lithuania borders Russia. And it also borders Belarus, which is a treaty ally of Russia and now also hosts Russian nuclear weapons. And Lithuania celebrated the German deployment and said that it was an example of NATO's Article 5 commitment, which outlines mutual defense. The Lithuanian defense minister said, quote, "We will create such a defense and deterrence architecture that no adversary from East will even think about testing NATO's Article 5, end quote. So Lithuania only has an active duty military of 15,000 troops. But despite that, Lithuania has been very bellicose toward Russia. One thing that they tried to do in 2022 that was completely crazy was they tried to basically impose an embargo on Kaliningrad, which, again, this is Russian territory. It's basically like Alaska, how Alaska is separated from the continental United States. Kaliningrad is separated from Russia. And they tried to ban the transport of sanctioned goods from Belarus to Kaliningrad that were being shipped by rail. And that included very basic things like concrete, wood, alcohol was another thing. And Russia was, saying they were going to respond. And then the Germany and the EU basically told Lithuania, no, you got to let this stuff through. And that's something you would think Lithuania would probably never do if it wasn't in NATO, if it didn't have this war guarantee from the US and all these other countries. So anyway, this is what happens when you have these alliances all over the country, all over the world. We see this with the Philippines. It's just so every part of the world, there's a country that the U.S. has given this war guarantee to. All right, so that is it for the news for today. Please go check out our viewpoints. One from Rick Sterling, Israeli milestones from 6-day victory to 6-month failure. One from Ted Galen Carpenter, ending the Second Cold War. One from James Bovard, Congress puts more nails in the constitutional coffin as it's set to renew FISA. One from Daniel McAdams, Israel is crossing all boundaries as America tires of its endless wars. One from Paul R. Pillar, is Israel's plan to draw the U.S. into a war with Iran. So go check all of that out. Go check out our blog. Lots of other stories lower down in the page. One thing I saw today that was really interesting. So on Tuesday night, Tucker Carlson put out an interview of a Palestinian pastor, Christian pastor who lives in Bethlehem. And it's a really great interview, and it shines a light on the plight of the Palestinian Christians in the West Bank and Gaza that we don't hear too much about, and just Palestinian Christians in general. And I see many people, you see people freaking out about it, people getting angry at Tucker for interviewing this guy. And whatever you think of Tucker Carlson, he basically just lets this guy talk. I think that's why people are so angry. The common reply that you see is, the Palestinian Authority controls Bethlehem, which is where this pastor is based, the town where Jesus was born, of course. And but that omits the context that surrounding Bethlehem, every Palestinian that lives in Bethlehem is under Israeli military occupation, in the sense that if they try to leave or probably even travel in certain areas in Bethlehem, there's Israeli military checkpoints. They can be arbitrarily detained, arrested for any reason. And of course, the wall that blocks the West Bank from Jerusalem, this wall that Israel started building in 2002, the apartheid wall, as it's known, basically goes through Bethlehem. They confiscated Palestinian land. I've read about Palestinian Christians who had their land taken for that project, and this means that Palestinian Christians in Bethlehem, they can't go to Jerusalem. They have to apply for these permits. So anyway, it's a good interview. You should go check it out. But that's it for me for today. You could always support us by sharing the show. Tell your friends about antiwar.com. I will be back tomorrow with some more news. Thanks for listening.